So often we categorize life into God and not God, spiritual and not spiritual, mystical and normal. Today we're going to step into an adventure of knowing that it's all God, knowing that everything that we could perceive or experience is spiritual. I don't know if you've kept up on some things in the news lately, but there was a program out and some articles on it about Archimedes recently. Did anyone catch that? Archimedes, who died in 12 BC, it was Archimedes of Syracuse. He was a leading scientist in the ancient Greek world. He was a mathematician, a physicist, an engineer, an inventor, and an astronomer. And what they have found recently is the remains of a shipwreck, a Greek shipwreck. And in that shipwreck, there was a round-shaped mechanism. And they could see some gears on it, and it was probably covered in coral, but they could tell enough that it was something, so they held on to it. What it turns out to be is possibly the first computer ever invented. It was a device created by Archimedes, and with this device, he could predict astrological events with great precise nature. Now, this is a long, long time ago, and this is a lost item. There's also a little story about a book and some writings that he had, and there's a lot of things that were duplicated in other places, but in this particular book, they found some of his work that wasn't duplicated in other places. And some of this work was an indication of what they think was the first understandings of calculus way before it was invented. I mean, we're talking BC here and then talking 1500 and 1700. So it was intelligence that was known way before, we caught on. So to some degree, you could say that this intelligence was found and then lost and found. And luckily, it wasn't disregarded this time. Luckily, it was seen, and there was known that there was something valuable there. It was looked at, and at a deeper glance, we can see that there is something pretty amazing that has been discovered that was really ancient. The other piece of the story is that in some of his writings that were found, there was probably a need for papyrus, but in a sanctuary somewhere, or some spiritual people took one of the books and actually, to use the papyrus, wrote over it. So kind of like erased what was there and wrote over it, and so wrote some prayers or something like that. And so only through, and then this book was later found and sold at an auction. But only through later technology could they actually get to see through the layers, and that's how they found the writing. That's how they found these calculations that he made. And part of it was getting round structures and getting volume and some intricate things like this. But this is information that was understood that he was getting to, that he had written his solutions, written his calculations, written his information, and then it was lost. And then we're trying to reinvent it again, right? Later on in life, we're reinventing the wheel because it was lost. So looking at what's lost and what's found, one of my favorite things about unity, and one of my favorite ways to describe unity, is where ancient wisdom meets new thought. Where ancient wisdom meets new thought. Because in unity, we're not about throwing out any bit of wisdom. Charles Fillmore explored all spiritual paths. He explored awakening on so many levels, in so many realms, in so many dimensions. And he didn't throw anything out. In fact, he pulled it all together into what we call unity. So this honoring of ancient wisdom, this honoring of traditions, last Sunday we talked about some of the Jewish traditions and the Jewish traditions around passing and how valuable some of them are. It's not about throwing out any of that. It's about inviting it in, right? So even the 12 powers, Charles Fillmore ideated the 12 powers, and it's these divine faculties within man, some of which are love, wisdom, life, that if we focus on these faculties and we raise them, we have an awakening. Well, that aligns with the chakra system. So it's this idea that nothing has to be thrown out, this idea that in unity, it's a spiritual practice, knowing that we're in a spiritual universe governed by spiritual law, where we don't have to throw out our thinking mind, where we don't close the door and say, oh, but that's not God. I was recently reading a talk from Charles Fillmore from 1913, and I was surprised, even in this talk, that he started going into science and some of the scientific, like biological, scientific, medical discoveries, and pointing to it and saying, there's God. See, there it is. There is the spiritual expansion, the evolution. There is life getting to live longer and creating through this intelligence. So he wasn't separating that from godness. He wasn't separating that from spiritual practice. To Charles Fillmore, everything was about the mystical, everything was about the spiritual, everything was included in spiritual practice. And those are the traditions that we stand on. That's the spiritual practice that we stand on. But how often does the human condition shut down a piece of something and say, well, that's not God. That's not spiritual. That's not religion. That's not whatever it is. That's not the answer. That's not the way. And box itself in. The human condition has a tendency to do that now, where it boxes itself in and it stops listening, right? We pray, we launch a prayer, but then we're only willing to think and see in a certain way and go, okay, well, that must be the answer to my prayer, and this must not be, because this is psychology, or this is medicine, or this is XYZ, fill in the blank, wherever you've told yourself that's not God. Some people do it with stem cell research. Some people do it with whatever, right? Fill in the blank, whatever it is. Learning to love and having different lifestyles, whatever it is. Where do we stop and say, ooh, something's wrong, something's not universal love, universal God? And we start boxing ourselves off and pressing ourselves away from the concept of God, rather than opening ourselves up to an experience of God. How could anything be not God? How could anything be not God? That's the invitation, to live in this exploration that every moment is a moment of awakening. The human condition, the human tendency is to think it's arrived at an answer, to think it has a solution. And once we think we have a solution to one thing, we put that thing up on a pedestal and we say to everyone, this is it, here it is. I've discovered it. This is how I eat, this is how I think, this is who I go to, this is what I do, this is the way. And it's this way, and so everyone should try it on, everyone should use it. It's either my system of religion, it's my system of education, it's my system of rearing children, it's my system of this, it's my system of that, whatever it is, but here it is, I did it, I discovered it, it is the way, everyone use it. So doesn't work, does it? So doesn't work. There's a positive intention there, though, is there not? There's a spiritual practice of saying, you know, all we can do for each other is point to something and say, this is how I found my way. But then it's for each of us to ideate it, to dive into it. So when we launch ourselves in our spiritual practice, we can have one foot in the realm of the metaphysical and one foot in the realm of the mystical. The metaphysical is the operation of laws, the knowing, the understanding of saying, okay, if I do this, then I will draw to me this. If I activate this principle, then I will see this result. What I have learned, my epiphanies I can try on, that might work for other people. I've tried to test these truths. I've proved something. I've explored. The mystical is saying, I have launched myself into a question, I have launched myself into a realm, I have launched myself into an experience, and once I have launched it, I am an open body, open-minded experience. And once that happens, the moment that happens, something else happens. Sometimes we can no longer see where the answers have come, because they have come from such a myriad of places. The awakening comes from such a plethora of experiences of intelligence. Have you ever had that where you prayed for a healing and you got it, or prayed for an answer and you got it, but if you were try to tell someone how to go get it for themselves or exactly where it came from, you'd start getting a little confused, going, well, but I did see that acupuncturist, but then remember in that meditation I had that healing, and then remember when I was talking to that person and they gave me that idea and I really dove into that idea, and from the moment I did, I was changed. But then when I did this, and then I was going to Unity every single Sunday at that time in my life, but then I also, remember that's when I stopped eating this way, right? And you begin not to have answers, but to live experiences. Because you begin to recognize that you can throw nothing out. Nothing out. And that is what all the sages, the saints, the spiritual teachers, the mystics through all times have done. They don't see mathematics as not being God. They know that in the dream state they get equations, and those equations are expressions of divine law. And they know that there's a mystical process going on, right? Charles Fillmore had dreams, and in the dreams he was guided to buy real estate. How practical and seemingly unspiritual is that? But then, what is that? And we're here on these grounds today because of those dreams that put together this worldly thing, which is where he has gifts for real estate, with this spiritual practice. So are we willing to remove the veil? Are we willing to remove the veil and step into the mystical way? Step into a full experience of life where ancient wisdom meets new thought, where we're not only allowed, but we're asked to keep our brains on, where we're taught to, as Scripture says, know that the word is written upon my own heart. So we're taught to test everything against our own heart, not take anyone's word for it, but to meditate on it and to know that the living word is within each one of us, to explore it, to ideate it, to bring it forth. And when we're taught to demonstrate and say the prayer, show me. So if there is to be truth in this, show me. Charles Fillmore said in this Sunday talk from 1913, he said, the two bases for life are one, to know the unseen things, and two, to better understand ourselves. One, to know the unseen things, and two, to better understand ourselves. So there's wisdom there, because to know the unseen things is to dive into the only way we can know unseen things, and the only way we can get something that is beyond our, humans' limited intelligence is to experience something, to test it, to try it out, to see if there's a law, to see if there's a principle, to activate it. That's the only way. And the only way we can better understand ourselves is to dive so deeply into the human condition, so deeply into the spiritual condition, and so deeply into ourselves. And when I say ourselves, I'm not just meaning me. I'm meaning you dive into yourself and you dive into everyone around you. You dive into the human psyche, into the human condition, and you begin to learn it. Not like you are it, but like you are an observer, like you are the explorer that is learning it. Dive into that space. I have a Unity minister friend who is very gifted in the Enneagram. And in conversations that we've had, she said, Erin, I have some concern. For, people in the practice, for people when they're trying, so hard to activate their healing, but they don't dive into some of the most intelligent information that we have as far as transpersonal psychology and learning about the mind and learning about the self. She was concerned that if we don't do that, we're going to miss some really important things. And I'll give you an example of part of the conversation. Part of the conversation was about being able to help with our patterns, blind spots, being able to awaken to ourselves, and different styles. In the Enneagram, you kind of explore what your framework is, your style, and with each framework, there are multiple frameworks, and with each framework, you have yourself at your highest functioning, and then you have yourself at your dysfunctioning, right? And so she was saying, when we're in tight spots or having difficult occasions, the way we process experiences are different. We all process very different. This is kind of like one religion doesn't fit all. This is kind of like one chiropractor doesn't fit everyone's body, one experience, one diet, one anything, right? One way of being in family, one way of being in relationship. There is no one fits all. That's what the ego tries to do. The ego keeps trying to say, I want to solve it. I want the one size fits all. Let me go to that store and buy that coat so I can wear it forever and give it to everyone so we can all be in a straitjacket. I don't know where that came from. Self-soothing with resentment, she said, is one of the types. Like one of the types. Well, when it goes to self-soothe, when we're in stress, then we go to self-soothe with resentment. And you can fill in the blank. Maybe you have another experience. So one is self-soothing with resentment. She said another may be self-soothing with feelings, self-soothing with sadness, self-soothing with loneliness, whatever it is. But that's the go-to. And she said the ironic thing is that for different styles, for some people, she said, you would encourage them to feel their feelings more. You need to sit with it. Sit with it and really feel what that sadness feels like. And then she said, but you take one of these other types. She said the last thing they need to do is sit with it. They are so good at sitting with it. They are the sitter. They are so sitting with it that they are identified with it, that they have become that emotion, that the line between them and the emotion has fallen away and they have been absorbed by it. They have been so absorbed by it that there is no reasonable objectivity. And she said, for that one, you don't encourage them to breathe into it more and to dive into it more. You encourage them to watch that. And when they watch that, when they see that, no, you're creating a neural pathway here. You're creating a pattern here. You're creating a little hitch in your giddy up that says, ooh, let's go into that self-soothing party. And you're practicing that. Rehearsing that, becoming that. She said for that person, they have no problem being with their feelings. Their strength, their healing, their direction is to go into objectivity, principle. What's reasonable here? What's practical here? Is this true? To become questioning. To question these things, to go, well, is it true that whatever it is, that this is how life is, and, here I am again. Is it true that that has to be my constant reality? She said applying objective thinking at that time is what helps this one out of it. When this one goes, oh, but this is how I see it. Then there's this other side of the same self, don't worry, that says, is that always true? Is that how it is? Is that how it was? Is that reality? And that practice actually brings one back to center, which is a place of health and harmony, right? But see, without these practices, without this intelligence that's developed in any area, right? Without this intelligence, we can get stuck. See, Charles Fillmore, I think, was at the forefront of inventing psychology. Psychology wasn't even really around in Fillmore's time. It wasn't really, a talked about around idea. But a lot of unity is about positive psychology. A lot of unity is about looking at the self. But without expanding our minds to what is outside of us and diving into all the multiple intelligence as out there, we limit our learning. And if we call that not God, if we call that not spiritual, and we call that psychology, or we call that medicine, or we call that this, then we shut ourselves off from and cut ourselves short from the epiphanies that are spiritual awakenings that show more of a mystical framework of life. I was overhearing some ladies talking at a coffee shop this week, and I wrote down the name of the book they were talking about, but one was just marveling. They were talking about spiritual things, and one was marveling at this new book that she grabbed, and she said that what she loved about it was that it was a scientist, but it was a scientist that was talking about God through science and showing that God exists, that even in the midst and kind of debunking all of these limited ideas where there's no God and saying, but that is all God. And the book was The Language of God, Francis Collins, and the subtitle is A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. But she was so excited about it, saying, like, even in the most medical communities, this conversation is happening. Even in this field, this conversation is happening. That was Charles Fillmore. If Charles Fillmore was here today, he'd be looking at everything from astrophysics to quantum physics to medicine. When we shut it off and when we see in black and white, we limit ourselves. Take even medicine, for example. Take even prescriptions. If we have black and white thinking, just like with that Enneagram example, there is one person who could use, say, let's give the example, because antidepressants are a big thing in our culture today. Give the example of antidepressants. If we make a blanket statement about them, right? You have one person that could be on them that will use it as a crutch and might just need it for a period of time, and then we'll be able to launch off of them. And they're willing to go on them. And then you may have another person that says, I got to do this through my spirituality. I've got to do this through my spirituality. I have to think my way into being better. I can't have to rely on something. And maybe it's that person that needs to say, yes, I am willing to be helped. Even this is God. And I will bless this little pill every morning. I will bless it through the fabric of my being. And if my guidance says it's time to launch off of it, I will do that. But here's the deal. I'm doing my spiritual work in the midst of this. And the black and white thinking tries to get an answer. It tries to say one or the other is good or bad or right or wrong. But the spiritual experience, the mystical experience, looks at the process within the being and goes, am I self-soothing through this suffering when actually my health is an applying principle? Or am I applying principle to such a neurotic degree that I can't even feel my nature, and I need to get into the experience of something and to be able to feel my soul and feel my tears? I need to break down my barriers, and the part of me that says I cannot be helped, the part of me that's not willing to look into other areas, that's not willing to see that my life can be different, that from this moment forward, there can be a change, and that change can be cataclysmic to my mind and elevate me to a new place and being, and I'm not going to limit in any way, shape, or form where I'm looking and where I'm open to experiencing that healing and that blessing. The human condition likes it to be so cut and dry, likes it to be so clean, but the spiritual journey is not clean. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. When people think they have arrived at the answers, when we think we have arrived at the answers, oftentimes that's the moment where we know we shut ourselves down. It's normal to be uncomfortable in exploration. It's normal to have awakening, feel like a paradox, feel like we've lost something, feel like we've found something. It's normal to put up lines and say, well, this is God, that's not God, this is spiritual, that's not spiritual. It's normal in humanity to have great inventions, great wisdom, and then disappeared, gone, we reinvent it, as if it's new. What do you think the Native American culture thinks about Whole Foods? Right? Oh, really? That's nice. There was a rabbi on Reverend Heidi Alfrey's Unity FM program recently. It's Rabbi Tom Samuels, and he talked about in Judaism, he said, In Judaism, he said, we're constantly reinforcing this idea. He said, constantly reinforcing this idea that the minute a text becomes fixed, the minute you have dogma or ideology or a state of being that becomes fixed, that is considered to be idol worship. So he talks about that idea of worshiping false idols in Scripture. And he says it's not just limited to or just about what we have been taught. He says idol worship is about creating a graven image, creating a solid thing, and saying, this is it. Saying, this is it. See how your hand is when you say, this is it? Rather than saying, this is it. This is it. He says, even Jewish law comes from the word to walk on a journey. A never-ending journey, an ever-evolving journey. He says, the minute the journey becomes static, you found you have the answer. Jewish tradition demands that you actually go deeper. That is the core of Jewish teaching. If you have the answer, you're not asking the right questions. If you have the answer, you're not asking the right questions. So what is out of bounds? The walk of the mystic is one in which you won't be able to point to anything that is out of bounds because it's about the journey. Ernest Holmes said, we should believe that God is the invisible partner in our lives and affirm that divine love goes before us and prepares a way. If you haven't seen this yet, Google Einstein's letter to his daughter. There's a letter that he left for his daughter, and it talks about his greatest discovery, the greatest scientific discovery, and he's leaving it with her. And he, in a very, very serious way, says that this is love. That this is love. Not just in a love spiritual la-la way. Love, as Charles Fillmore talked about it, as the great harmonizer, an actual power, an actual energy force, an energy field, a thing that would be worthy of scientific study. The master teacher said, I am the way and the truth and the life. Went on to say, only through me, which people have manipulated that phrase to make it limiting to people who voice their spiritual practice in a certain way. I am is the true nature. That's what the master teacher was referring to, the I am nature. He was always identified with that I am nature, always saying the source and I are one, the Father and I are one, always saying the I am nature is the true nature, the true essence, the idea of humanity and the mind of God. We are that expression of that idea. He said, I am the way and the truth and the life. Well, what is the way? I think the way is the consciousness, the awakened mind. That only through that consciousness and that awakened mind may I experience my oneness, may I receive my enlightenment, may I be awakened. The truth in unity we teach is the law, God as law. The trying on and understanding of spiritual law, which goes beyond what we call religion. It goes into science, it goes into medicine, it goes into psychology, it goes into the human condition, it goes into everything. It actually usurps the physical law, but it can be found in everything. That's the truth. And the life, only through the life. I believe that life is knowing that everything is life, and it is of the one life, that there is one life, and that is God life, and that is each of our lives now. Charles Fillmore said, I have soul consciousness, I have a spirit. He said, I am the only begotten Son of God. The Christ of God is in me potentially. He said, to realize this will awaken the truth. That is what the master teacher did, and that is what the master teacher taught. He taught this awakening, so too you will have. That only begotten Son is the one Son, which is the daughter, which is the birth of humanity, which is the birth of all beings as one, not reserved in some other time and space. I close with some words from Joel Goldsmith. He says, God is the self of me, and therefore it is myself that is omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient. It is not some self from thousands of years ago. It is not some self that is up in heaven. It is myself, thyself, ourself, the one infinite divine self, which is omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, the self of me. He says, there is no place where I leave off as the life of one or begin as the life or mind of another, because all is one. I flow through all, in all, as all. I am the I am nature. I am also the flow. I am in musical sound, yet I am the sound itself. Of all creation, I am the essence, the fiber, the fabric, the form, the action, the very mind, and the very life. That is the nature. God is, I am. Namaste.